Side 10. Cathy had no idea what to do next. No more, it seemed, than Jason or even Nick did. They all stood silently, engulfed in an atmosphere which was as thick as smog. But speared by the hurt she could see in Jason's face, and unable to explain herself properly in Nick's presence, Cathy acted purely on instinct. She became defensive, and there was a genuine shard of indignation inside her. Hadn't Jason disappeared again this weekend? Off to Paris? Hadn't he told her he'd be away for the entire weekend? She never quizzed him about his activities when he was away from her. Why should he suddenly arrive at her house with no warning and expect to be welcomed like the prodigal son? It was as if he lived there, which would have been absolutely fine if he did live there and were around to do all the caring, supporting and listening that somebody who lived there might have done. But he didn't live there, and these days he wasn't a particularly frequent visitor. So instead, realizing that she had to do something to break the silence, Cathy found herself saying, "Jason, how can you just walk in here like this? You trying to catch me out or something?" to Jason, and watched his chin drop in surprise. "Your keys were in the door," he said eventually. "Anybody could walk in here." "Thank you for pointing that out," Cathy said haughtily, edging over to the box and snatching her keys from the top. She crept away from Jason again. "So?" Jason looked straight into Cathy's eyes. He seemed alarmingly quiet, but he appeared to have no intention of storming out. Cathy almost wished he would. It might ease the nauseous feeling in her stomach. "Cathy, is this what happens when I'm not here?" "Don't be silly, Jason," Cathy snapped, her voice sounding strained even to her own ears. "You're drinking the Julienus." Jason looked at the bottle unhappily. "The one we were saving. And you're sunburned. Your nose is bright pink." Cathy swallowed. "I went to Lord's today," she said. Jason nodded. Behind her, Cathy was aware that Nick was still standing motionless and silent, but Jason hadn't once attempted to look Nick in the eye. "I guessed as much. And is this the guy with his arm around you in that picture in the Sun?" "We were in the paper," Nick muttered almost to himself. "Not now, Nick," Cathy stated. "Jason, that's a coincidence. We happened to be sitting next to each other at both matches." Jason looked bewildered, and no wonder, she reasoned. "That is a coincidence," he said, and for the first time Cathy heard the edge in his voice. "Really, I have no idea why that happened. It's something to do with Frank, but we haven't worked out what yet. Then Nick missed his train back to Birmingham," she rattled on. Nick said nothing. Cathy could almost feel his height and bulk casting a shadow across the room. "And because he's stranded in London, I offered to put him up on the sofa bed. Sofa bed, I mean." "You're drunk," Jason observed. "Yes." Cathy felt she couldn't really deny that, although Jason's arrival had certainly started the sobering-up process. "I came straight here from the airport, Cathy." Jason had lowered his voice, as if he was speaking to Cathy intimately, and Nick couldn't hear. "I brought you the wine. He stopped, and Cathy saw his Adam's apple rise and fall as he swallowed. Then Jason looked at Nick. Cathy watched in dismay as his dark eyes flickered with emotion, but his voice was steady. "I think one of us had better leave, don't you?" Cathy glanced at Nick cautiously. He looked very calm, but she guessed that at that size there wouldn't be many men who could be a threat to him. And she could only imagine, although she couldn't know it, that he'd been in one or two rough pubs in his time. He'd probably dished out his fair share of bruises. After a peaceful assessment of Jason, Nick returned his gaze to Cathy. "If you'd like me to leave," he said in a quiet voice, "I'll leave." "Where will you go?" Cathy asked logically. "It's nearly 1 o'clock. The tubes won't even be running from here this late." Nick shrugged. "I'll sort something out." "Why don't you do that, then?" Jason suddenly erupted at Nick. Cathy was surprised.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?